So I'm going to be talking about comparing different sources of crime data in general. If you want a little bit more detail and information about UCR, NIBRS, NCVS, and self-report surveys, definitely go check out my other videos on those first. But this is just more of a general overview of the different sources of crime data. So starting with the UCR. So the UCR has a number of strengths. It's first of all, you get the number and the characteristics of all reported crime, or at least everything that is submitted to the UCR by the police departments. It is a consistent national sample that is taken annually, so it's really great for comparing, over time and in different areas, and based on, if there's new policy changes, things like that, you want to see sort of how it affects at least reported crime. This is great for that. It represents more than 90% of the population, because even though not all police departments report, typically most of the bigger ones do, and so when we look at the actual representation of the population, it represents more than 90% of the population. Now that might change because of the changes that have happened as of January 1st, 2021 in terms of the basic UCR, the SRS system, no longer being in place. That's kind of being retired, and it's now moved to the NIBRS only system. We will see how much of the population is represented once it turns to NIBRS, but I talked more about that in one of the previous videos. But the UCR is still considered a gold standard in terms of research, in terms of, when we're looking at reported crime, it's the go-to for information, especially when you want to look at historical trends and things like that. There are some weaknesses, though. It omits crimes that are not reported to police, so we're only getting reported crime. Part 1 crimes also, even though they are the most serious crimes, they don't represent the majority of crime. And that's because we know that the most serious crimes happen the least frequently, which is good. We don't want murder to be as common as like common theft. But that does mean in terms of the number of crimes, we're actually missing the majority of crimes, because most crimes are sort of part 2, not as serious type crimes in terms of number. Now, in terms of damage done, part 1 crimes are the ones we want to be focusing on. But we just sort of need to know that when we're using UCR data. And then, of course, a big drawback is the hierarchy rule, which means that if there's one incident that contains multiple crimes within a single incident, only the most serious one is counted. So we lose a lot of information there. When we look at the NCVS, National Crime Victimization Survey, there's major strengths here where we're tapping into those the dark figure of crime, because we're getting unreported crimes. We're getting information on victim characteristics that may not have reached the level of being reported to the police. And actually, even if we look at UCR data, it typically doesn't give very much information about the victims because it's more focused on the offender. So this gives us more information about victims. It's also, we get more than just part 1 offenses. There's ask about almost any potential way you could even think to be victimized, that the NCVS asks about that. The detail that is part of the NCVS ensures that the crimes do meet the criteria for inclusion for various different categories, because the questions are clearly laid out and it's very specific language. Also, that short recall period of 6 months means that it's probably a lot more valid than asking for details about things that happened years ago or potentially within somebody's lifetime. So those are some of the major strengths of the NCVS, but there are some weaknesses as well. So it does rely on victim accuracy, and as I discussed in a little more detail in the previous video, there are some issues here in terms of both over and under reporting for various different reasons. Also, something you might not have thought about, but so some crimes are not included. If you think about murder is not going to be included, at least not directly, because can you ask a murder victim about their victimization? No, because they're dead. So while you can get information about, if family members have been affected and things like that, you can't get direct information from the victim. But also victimless crimes. So things like public drunkenness or prostitution or illegal drug use or gambling, those things you wouldn't get information on those because there's no victim to ask about those things. Also, because the NCVS goes to households, it's not going to include commercial establishments, so we won't know about commercial robberies or assaults that happen within workplaces and things like that from the commercial standpoint. So we wouldn't get information there, or whether it's about the people within the establishment or the establishment itself. Also, for a similar reason, we wouldn't get information from prisoners or from the homeless because they don't have a home to go to. because there's an actual household the NCVS has to actually go to, the researchers. And also, as we know, it doesn't include victims under the age of 12. So those are some notable weaknesses of the NCVS. Then when we look at self-report surveys, some advantages here are that this is a different way to tap into that dark figure of crime, getting those unreported crimes, because it's, instead of asking about victimization, you're asking about criminal perpetration. So it's a different way to tap into that unreported crime number that we are always trying to learn more about. And here you're going to get more information on the offender characteristics, because you're asking about perpetration, so then you know more about the offender that did various things, whatever you're asking about. Now, it's kind of a weakness, but kind of a strength when we think about self-report surveys. They can be tailored to address whatever issue you want, essentially. But the reason for that is because there is no one national self-report survey. So it's bad because you can't look at like an annual report, so there's no patterns that you can examine over time. Or there are some annual self-report surveys that are fairly large, like the Monitoring the Future study is a big one, but nowhere near like the size of the NCVS or like the UCR or NIBRS. Like, we just don't have anything that big that's asking about criminal perpetration. But it's good because then that means you can use a self-report survey to examine a specific question of interest or concern. So it's kind of under as a weakness as well that you don't have the national consistent validated self-report survey, but that kind of serves as a strength too. Although, I mean, technically you could design a victimization survey for any issue that you'd like as well. But another major weakness of self-report surveys is that it relies on the offender honesty, which you have issues of both accuracy, which is similar to the victimization study, but also issues of integrity, because now you're asking about perpetration, so there's going to be extra hurdles to overcome there. So some other ways to obtain crime data is through cohort research. So cohort research is basically anytime you're looking at a group of people who share some characteristic, and then there's some kind of, looking at that group over time. And that characteristic could be, there's a birth year, so you want everybody who's about the same age, so who would have grown up in the same amount of time, or it could be like a graduation year, or graduation cohort. Or it could be like everybody who was present at a certain event. So, maybe somebody wants to research, everybody who was present at, something big like Sandy Hook shooting, or like 9/11 or something. And so then everybody has that in common. And so then let's look at whatever else it is we're interested in. But that defines our sample. And then you can ask about anything. You can ask about education, family, police, health, like anything. It's just the cohort is defined based on that starting point. Then we can also do experimental research. And so if you're doing a controlled experiment to look at some kind of cause of crime. Now, while there are different types of experiments, if we want a true experiment, there are 3 elements that are required here. The first is that you have to have at least 2 groups, the experimental group and the control group. And the control group could mean that they have nothing as opposed to the thing that's being tested in the experimental group, or it could just be a different form. So if it's like a treatment, then maybe there's like the standard like current treatment that certain offenders maybe get in prison. But then there's this new treatment that we're going to see if it actually does better. So then the experimental group would have the new treatment, the control group would have the old treatment. So it might mean they don't have any treatment as a control, but it might mean they have an older version, or like a already sort of dated kind of thing that's already currently in place or something. But you have to have those 2 groups, and then key here is that there has to be random assignment to those groups. So there has to be no systematic differences between those groups before the study starts, which is tough. That's the toughest thing to do an experiment, to have a truly experimental research, because often you can't randomly assign. If I'm looking at something like the effects of childhood trauma, I can't randomly assign childhood trauma to one group. So I have to deal with what is there. So, but random assignment could be for something like, if we're looking at like a policy or a treatment, you can randomly assign who gets what treatment, or who gets treatment versus no treatment. You can randomly assign that. So if you can do it, this is what you need to do to have a true experiment. Otherwise, it's what's called a quasi-experiment. And then the other requirement is basically you're assessing the change in the outcome, which is kind of a gimme, because that basically means you're seeing if the thing that you're testing had the effect. And so if you're not looking to see what the effect was, then what's the point of doing it? So if we're seeing if a a treatment in prison works, then we're going to test to see if those people are more or less likely to recidivate upon release, let's say. If you don't test that, if you don't look at that, then what are you doing? So experimental research is another way to get crime data. Another way is through observational and interview research. So this typically looks at a relatively small number of subjects because you're going in depth. And it's either an in-depth interview, so you're sitting and talking to somebody for hours or whatever, or it's an in-depth observation, which may actually take place over a long period of time, depending on sort of how in-depth the observation goes. But relatively can still include a good number of people, but you just can't reach the number that like national databases can, or large-scale surveys or things like that. Then you have meta-analyses. So a meta-analysis is where data is basically gathered and combined from multiple previous studies. So you're getting all these previous studies and then essentially combining what are called effect sizes to then sort of see how big all of the effect sizes are when you put them all together to see like what is the overall finding about this relationship between two variables. Compare that to a systematic review, and a systematic review is where you are looking so you're still gathering a whole bunch of previous studies that have looked at the same topic, but now you're just looking at their findings. So you might be like, well, 5 studies found a positive relationship and 1 study found no relationship. So overall, there seems to be a positive relationship between these two variables. So you're not looking at the numbers, you're just looking at the overall findings. And then compare that one step further to data mining. And this is where you're going deeper than the meta-analysis and going to the data sets and actually combining those data sets and then running your own analyses on the now large data set. So that's sort of a deeper dive and looking really at, so we're just going to sort of combine these data sets, get a really big sample, and then see what's going on. And then we have crime mapping, which is basically where you're looking at the spatial geography of crime. And so you literally are mapping crimes on a map and seeing, where they cluster, and maybe they cluster in certain areas or at certain times. And that's kind of the main focus of crime mapping. And just as an example, here is the Vancouver Police Department. They've updated their system, but this is just sort of a good way to look at what a crime map would look like. And so you can see, so this is looking at commercial break-in enters, so we can see I think there's some clustering that happens like in the central business district, which makes sense because that's where a bunch of commercial buildings are. So we're going to see commercial break-in enters there. Compare that to residential break-in enters, that's a lot more spread out because residential neighborhoods are all over the place. So you're going to see that. And this is just with 1 week's worth of data. And then we look at like stolen vehicles. That's going to be a little bit more spread out. But then compare that to theft from vehicles, and that happens way more often, so there's way more incidents of it, but that's also going to be, you see a lot of clustering around that central business district again, because that's where all the commercial buildings are, that's where people park their cars, go to work all day, their cars are left unattended, they're going to be broken into, more likely. So we can sort of look at those crime maps like that can tell us information about where these crimes are happening, when these crimes are happening as well, because you could sort of select for certain times or certain days of the week or night versus day, things like that, and compare on a map as well.